Back again with today's radio, which is a Perdio. You can just about make out the logo there, or the name on the logo, Perdio. Whenever I hear the name of that manufacturer, I'm always reminded of the jazz standard Perdido, which is something completely different. But nevertheless, it always enters my head every time I see this make of radio. Perdio was a company formed in the late 1950s. Perdio is a contraction of the term personal radio, and it was formed by an ex-military guy. And the idea was that they started off making transistor radios. They never made valve radios in the way that the bigger manufacturers did. They were going to get in on the ground floor of the new technology and not do any of that old stuff. A bit like Tesla, who never made an internal combustion engine vehicle, started off making electric vehicles. I suppose the jury's out still on whether or not that will work out for Tesla in the long term. It certainly didn't work out for Perdio. They didn't last very long, overreached themselves, built a massive factory, went bankrupt, got taken over by Dansette, which is another brand we'll look at later. Anyway, this is from, I believe, 1961. It is a Model 95, and I wonder if the guy from his military experience decided to ring up the material supplier and say, could you just get your catalogue out and find the blandest, most institutional, military-like camouflage type coverings for my new radio, and I'll have as many of them as you can supply, because they certainly didn't put a lot of flair into this. I think a wartime receiver from a Lancaster would probably have looked better. That said, it's not a bad set, and it has something which a lot of portable sets at the time would not have had, and that is FM. Most of the portable sets that we look at from around that time, long wave and medium wave only. So it promises quite a bit, really. I have had a few struggles with this one. One of the things that is a problem, of course, is this cracked tuning scale, and the tuning scale is printed onto this Perspex here. So there's no real prospect of my ever repairing it or getting another one, so it's a pity because I can't really do anything about that. The other thing is it's got some caked on dark stuff. I don't know whether it's tobacco, cigarette tar or something like that. And it's taken a long time to get it off. It's taken quite a lot of elbow grease. I think I might have to resort to mechanical means with that. But electrically, I had a few issues with it. It has quite a lot of noise, like a lot of receivers of that time. So if I just turn it on and don't turn the volume up, you might be able to hear, I'm not sure whether you can, that there is a sort of background hiss. That's not uncommon with these sort of germanium transistor type of radios. That said, when you get the sound on...
An accident from junction 2 for Dudley to junction 1. As you can imagine, traffic is very quickly building up there, so do expect delays. In Kent, there's a lane closed on the M2.
Pretty solid, quite good bass. It's got a top cut button on here, like a lot of radios have, in lieu of a tone control.
Congestion to Westfield, so the A249 is also looking pretty slow.
And if you listen to it on FM...
Available to download and keep in the trade. Get quality timber at Wickes. Pick up 2.4 metre stud-work CLS timber from £4.28 as a Trade Pro member. Terms apply.
Today, we are looking for new and better ways to reduce our carbon...
So you can see the FM sounds pretty good on in its normal setting, and then you put the top cut control on. You see a lot of these top cut controls, and I have a sort of theory about these, especially in the early days of FM, because I know that when my grandparents used to have a radio, and they used to listen to Radio 2 on medium wave, as it was then, and possibly even long wave, and I would, they had a VHF radio maybe, and I would turn it over from, I said, why are you listening to this on medium wave or long wave? You've got VHF. You turn it over to VHF, you get a much nicer, clearer signal. And they say, oh no, I don't like that. It's a bit too tinny. They didn't like the idea of music sounding like it actually sounds on a decent sound system. And that's not a criticism, that's just the way people grew up. These weren't people who had gone to concerts and things. So what they knew music to sound like was what it sounded like on medium wave radio. And I think when they introduced FM, they had a bit of a problem selling this bright sound to a lot of older people who were not really used to it and didn't really want it. And I think these little top cut buttons were an aim to get around that. That's just my theory. I could be completely wrong about that. Anyway, getting back to what the issues were with it. The noise was much worse originally than it is now, so I decided to change a couple of things. To improve the noise, I changed a few resistors, so I thought some of the high-value resistors might be a bit noisy. I did improve it a little bit, but not massively. I think a lot of it is inherent. But one of the issues I had with this was crossover distortion on this Class B germanium output stage. Now, I thought we'd have a little sidebar here, because we don't normally go very much into theory on these things, and if you already know about this, or you're not in the least bit interested, then feel free to skip it. So essentially the problem I need to solve here is how to drive my loudspeaker, which I'm going to draw like this, from my transistor amplifier. Now, in order to drive it, I need some electricity, and electricity in this radio set comes in the form of the PP9 battery here, which, as we know, supplies 9 Great British volts. And that's all we got to play with. We've got 9 volts on one end, 0 volts on the other. We can't have 9 point anything volts, we can't go above 9 volts, and we can't go below 0. Which means we've got a swing here. If we look at the speaker, we have a peak to peak of 9 volts, and probably a little bit less because we wouldn't want to drive it right up against the limits. And what that means is that any amplifier that's driving this has got to start off to get the maximum swing in the middle of this. So your amplifier stage, if it was say a single transistor, will be starting off at 4.5 volts here when there is no signal. Now, I can't connect that directly to my speaker, because if I do that, I'm going to burn it out. We don't want 4.5 volts DC across the speaker, so we isolate it in some way. Now, in older radios, including the one we're looking at today, this was done via a transformer. So the speaker goes on this end of the transformer, where there is no connection to the battery, and the transistor is here, and the 4.5 volts here. DC does not appear on the speaker. All that appears on the speaker is the AC component. In later radios, we tend to have the 4.5 volts appearing here again on the top, on the collector of the transistor, but it will be got rid of via a polarized electrolytic capacitor, and that will connect to the speaker. Now, this actually gives better quality, but this is cheaper, and this is also more reliable because these things dry out and fail, but this is cheaper. This does take up more space. This is cheaper. Did I mention this is cheaper? That's why everything changed over from doing this to doing this. But we're in this world with this particular radio set. Now, this is assuming we use a single transistor and we set that at 4.5 volts. When we do that, we call that a Class A amplifier. The problem with it is if I'm having my transistor at 4.5 volts even when there's no signal, then I have to have current running through it even when there's no signal, and that's wasting power. If it was in a mains powered hi-fi amplifier, that might not be much of a problem, but again, we've got a battery here and we don't want to run it down. It's a portable radio. We don't have to keep changing the batteries quicker than we need to. So a different solution is needed here. You might not be entirely surprised to learn that the solution is what we call Class B. And what that means is that instead of having one transistor, I have 2 transistors, and I connect them back to back like so. And let's assume the transformer here with my speaker here. And what we do is we arrange the bias of these transistors so that they're not set halfway up their conducting range, they're set right at the bottom, which means that if we have another transformer here, when we have a positive going signal, this one conducts and drives the speaker. When we have a negative going part of the signal, this one conducts and drives the speaker. And as well as being called Class B, this is sometimes referred to, for pretty obvious reasons, as being called a push-pull, in that these things conduct alternately. The only problem with this is that we're assuming, looking at this, that when we turn the transistor on that it's nice and linear, but it isn't. That will be like a resistor, but the transistor doesn't do that. The transistor has a little bit here and then conducts, which means that if I set this precisely on where the transistors turn on and off, then instead of getting this at the output, which is what I'd like, I actually get something more like that. And these bits where it goes flat here are corresponding to this bit of the transistor characteristic. In order to deal with that, what we do is we actually slightly turn them on a little bit so that they are both actually conducting at the lower end. So it's not quite pure class B, in fact it's what we call class AB. So here's the actual circuit, and we can see the two transistors here, the push-pull transistors. And what I was finding was I was getting quite a lot of crossover distortion. Now what they tell you is to adjust this variable resistor here to get rid of that, but it wasn't really having any effect. If I put a resistor across this transistor and increase the current effectively going through these pair, then it brought it back where it should be, which suggested to me this transistor was a bit low on its DC gain. Now, these are all OC81 germanium transistors that are no longer made, and the other odd thing about them is that when you, because of the crossover distortion requirement, these two transistors have to be quite closely matched. Now, mostly transistors have quite a spread of gain levels. Typically for germanium transistors, there'd be anything from like 80 to 200. Which doesn't matter if you design your circuit properly, because your bias network nulls out any effect of the spread of the HFE of the transistor. But when they're sharing the same bias network as the two are in a class B output stage, then you don't really get away with that, so you have to get two fairly closely matched transistors. So in the factory, they'd have picked out a load of pairs of transistors that they knew were closely matched in order to make the sets. When you bought replacements for them, you wouldn't know whether what you got matched one of those, and you may not have enough in stock unless you were a professional radio repairer to be able to go through and find two that match. So what they used to do was sell you these two plus this one, which is slightly lower gain, marked as an OC81D for the driver, and they'd sell these three as a set. So the idea being that if you replace one of these transistors, you'd replace the others as well. Now, obviously, I can't get these transistors at all, so I thought, well, there's no choice really to put a silicon one in place of this one. So I did that, and as expected, the gain then rockets, because silicon transistors much higher gain. I had to adjust a lot of this bias around here, and eventually got it just about working with a little bit of oscillation, so I put an extra capacitor in to try and snub that out, which seems to have worked. So we're back to normality on this one, with a bit of extra work. So there we go, we've finally escaped the perdition of the Perdio. I'm not sure it's been worth the effort really, and there's still a bit to do at it in terms of cleanup. But it is an interesting example of a radio of its time, and quite rare I think, so overall it's probably worth having, but I wouldn't say it's been one of my favourites.